In the second video of this lecture, I will explain how to respond to an IT crisis. This video is a summary of chapters 10, 11, and 18, which is about the crisis, the damage it caused, and how to manage IT risks. First, let me give you a summary of the case. IBK's website was locked up due to a DDoS attack, where the website gets flooded with useless traffic um, sent by many computers uh, who the attacker has control on. IBK's customer service application was also down, and at first they thought that the connection was the issue, or the database file was corrupted, but after a while, they found that the database file has been renamed, and that was quite easy to resolve. However, that made them suspicious of, the attacker have control on the, you know, on the database files and everything, so as a result, he or she could have access to and steal customers' data. At the same time, they also received a continuous flow of emails with the title "Gotcha," and security team checked all logs, but they were not able to find any traces of unauthorized access to database or any files. So either they are very good, these attackers, or attacker is very good, or nothing happened. So we want to figure out what we can learn from the way the IT department and the CIO respond to this IT crisis. The first thing that we can learn from the CIO, Jim Barton, and his direct reports was the way they communicated that materialized IT risk with top executives. They used a language that that was not technical that much, and they were able to explain the various scenarios, various uh, issues in a way that these top executives could understand, and that's quite important because you want the top executives to do the trade-off between cost and benefits of various actions that you can take. Um, Otherwise, you as IT department need to make that decision, and you can be held accountable for choosing the wrong decision. So first, I will go over what IT risk is, and then after that, I will explain how Jim Barton and the IT department uh, could communicate IT risk in a language that top executives can understand. Risk is defined as the multiplication of probability by impact. So when we say that something is high risk, that means that it has an extreme or major impact, and the probability of that event occurring is quite medium or high. When something is low risk, we usually mean that it can rarely occur, that event, or uh, the impact is trivial or minor. So in the literature on risk, there are two conceptualization of risk. First, risk as a probable negative impact, and second, risk as both negative and positive impact. Uh, Here, in the second type of conceptualization of risk, if risk is considered as a probable negative outcome, it is called downside risk. Otherwise, if the risk can end up with positive outcome, um, then that's an upside risk. So as for this lecture, we define IT risk as the potential for an unplanned event involving information technology to threaten an enterprise objective. So we are more aligned with the first conceptualization of IT risk or downside risk. To communicate this IT risk with the business, Westerman and Hunter suggested the 4A framework. They believe that any types of issues at the IT level should be translated into these four types of risk so that the business can understand and make decision, and as a result make decision about that issue. The first uh, perspective, the first type of IT risk is related to availability, where you would like to keep the systems and as a result, the business processes that are dependent on those systems running. And you also want to recover from the disruptions, from hiccups as fast as possible. So if you cannot do that, the business is in danger. So business managers, they understand availability of the business processes quite easily. The second type of IT risk is related to proper access to the information. It's related to confidentiality of the uh, data. So here organizations try to ensure appropriate access to data. They want to make sure that the right people have access to the data and the unauthorized paper cannot have access to data, and the sensitive information such as customers, social security number, customers address are safe and are not accessed by people who are not authorized to have access to them. So if you fail to do that, if you fail to provide a proper access, then the student can, the managers, top managers can easily understand the repercussions. The third type of uh, issue that can arise from IT is problems with accuracy or integrity of data. Uh, IT is supposed to provide correct data, complete information, and provide them, a timely the latest update of, the data, so that managers can make the best decision possible. Customers can rely on the information that they get from the company. Regulators are not going back and penalize you for providing wrong information. So if you can explain an IT issue in terms of uh, the problem with the integrity of data, with the accuracy of data, then business managers can understand it quite easily. And the fourth type of uh, IT issues can be related to agility, where your systems uh, are not agile enough, which means that you cannot change the business applications, the hardwares, the network components with an appropriate cost, and more importantly, in a timely manner. So some other types of issues can be explained, IT issues can be explained in terms of agility. So Jim Barton and his direct report explained things using the first three types of risk that we just saw: accuracy risk, availability risk, and access risk. So, for example, uh, when they explained the DDoS attacks, where the website was flooded and as a result customer service was down, a website was not functioning, they mentioned that we have an outage. That means the systems are not available, and the managers could easily understand. Okay, oh, this system, the customer service is not available. this is going to be its ramification. Website is not available, this is going to be the consequences. When they all explained malicious codes, they also talked about the effect of that on access risk and accuracy risk. They explained that this malicious codes can allow the hacker to uh, come back again and have access to the data. They also mentioned that perhaps this malicious codes can change the data. With regard to renaming the database, they also explained that this can be one of the issues with one of the reason behind the availability of the systems. With regard to uh, disconnected communication between the application and the database, they also explain that in terms of the availability, that this can be a reason for the unavailability of the applications and the business processes that are dependent on that. About database file being corrupted, they explain that this can have ramifications on, you know, the availability of the website as well as even the accuracy of the data that we have. They also uh, talked about the data being stolen, the chance of data being stolen, which is, a type of access risk. They also uh, suggested that it uh, was possible that the attackers, change the data, which can be categorized under accuracy risk. So in a way, they explained things in a way that could be understandable to business managers. And believe me, many IT practitioners do not have these capabilities. So sometimes in your role, you can guide them to talk in, to speak in terms of these four types of risk, with you or other business managers. Pause here for a minute and answer this question, as well as this question, and finally this question. Another interesting aspect of the chapters 10 and 11 was the way the CIO and the IT department responded to the IT crisis. I will go to the detail of the IT response, how the IT, the technical world responded to the issue, the customer contact strategy that the IT department suggested for the business, and also the way CIO communicated the issues with the CEO and other external entities in the market. First, let's go over the technical response by the IT department. The first issue was that the website was locked up due to a DDoS attack and materialization of IT availability risk. So the way that the IT department resolved this issue was by stop responding to the attacking IP addresses. IP addresses are like, telephone numbers. So you can understand this by assuming that you're at the call center and you're receiving, 1,000 files per day, but someone uses 7 or 8 uh, phone numbers to call you and cause trouble for you. So what you do is you add those numbers to the blacklist. So as soon as you receive call from them, you disconnect uh, the phone, the connection. So with that, you don't go to the process of answering the phone and then after 5 or 7 seconds understand that the call was, useless. So that's the way that we, in the IT world, you can also do. You can also, do something like that by stopping to respond to those attacking IP addresses. The second issue was that the customer service system was down because the database file was renamed. So as a result, the application could not find the database to, get data from, insert data in, and update data. So what the IT team did was just simply rename the database to its original name, and the app could easily, detect the database and get connected to that. The second issue was that the IT department was afraid that customer data was stolen and even could be stolen again in future. There were some security holes in the network of IVK, and the IT department was also afraid of, malicious codes being left by the attacker in the on the computers. So even if they could patch up the security holes, those malicious codes could still allow the attacker to get connected to the computers. So for the security holes, they went for a fast track upgrade of the network technology, and they even plan to go for a newer version of a new type of network technology. As for the malicious codes, their original plan was to remove suspicious files, but later we understood that that was not possible. I'm going to discuss that in the next slide. There was also another issue. The IT department was concerned that, the accuracy of the data are compromised. Um, the database wall was assumed corrupted at first, which was, which could be a case of accuracy, and the attackers could also have changed the data. What they could do is to use the backup that they already had and try to build the database again. So that was their plan. But even that plan had issues because they would lose some data that were collected, uh, 5 hours before the incidents. So they would still lose data, but at least they have a kind of database that they know that everything is correct and untouched. The technical response to the malicious codes was quite, you know, a difficult decision. They couldn't figure out, the IT department couldn't figure out what is the correct way to do that. And the reason was that the IT department couldn't tell if the file that they have on the computer are, you know, are malicious codes or not. And that's because they don't have, the IT department didn't keep a careful records of all files that were introduced during installing new applications. So if you don't know what files should be on your computer, then you cannot figure out what file should be removed as suspicious files and what file can be there. And you may mistakenly remove a file that you need. So what can the IT department do? There were several scenarios, uh, and there are three options. The IT department can do nothing. They can shut down the entire system and then go back to the installation files and try to install and rebuild everything. And this third option was to build a mirror web, service, a mirror application. That means that you keep the current system running, but you create a new system, a new computer, new computers, and you create new systems, and you install all those applications there. So as soon as you're done with creating that mirror file, you shut down the system that you are concerned about, and you use the mirror uh, website or computer system that you created. So these are the three actions that the IT department could go for. However, with regard to different scenarios, we could have no intruders. Uh, in that case, doing nothing would be great. So if everything was a hoax and no one was inside and there inside the computers and there is no malicious codes, then it's uh, do nothing would have been the would be the best action. If we have tricksters, not malicious attackers, the attackers who just want to have fun, then do nothing would be the great the best action to take. If it was a malicious intruder but does not want to continue, again, do nothing is the right action. However, if the attackers, the hackers, did some subtle adjust in data, they changed the data and even perhaps the backups, and the organization does not do anything, then there can be legal implications. IBK could see customer lawsuit, shareholder lawsuit, and government penalties. If customer data is already stolen and copied to somewhere outside IBK, again, it can have legal implications if you do nothing. In these cases, uh, then it's better to go for either shut down and rebuild or build a mirror website. If the malicious codes still exist on the computers, and attackers will attack soon, do nothing have all those issues, those legal implications. However, here in between the shutdown and build a mirror, you have to go for the shutdown because you don't want the attackers to have access to to the customer data or to the sensitive data. If the malicious code exists, but attackers won't attack us soon, then we'd better go for creating, a mirror. Because we don't, if we shut down everything for 4 or 5 days, it can cause a huge reputational damage to the company. And other than that, you lose some businesses during these 4 days. So this is quite a great option here to build a mirror if the attackers does not intend to attack again sometime soon. The CIO and the IT department team also had a great understanding of, the components of a disclosure strategy. They knew what, they should make decision about. So I'm going to discuss this in the next video. Another interesting aspect of this story was the way CIO communicated IT incident with, the CEO and the external analyst. With the CEO, he had this policy of always telling the CIO the bad news as soon as the possibility is known, and not to postpone that until he knows for sure that something bad is happening. So this is a great lesson that we can learn from Jim Barton. Second, the way that he managed the analyst, the way that he had different scenarios for, what kind of question they're going to ask him and how he's going to respond. So first of all, his strategy was not to bring up the attack at all unless an analyst does so. Why to, create a negative, image if that can be, avoided. Uh, and second, if an analyst brings up the issue, we acknowledge that an attack occurred, but we would say that DDoS attacks are extremely common and the IVK handled that well. So this approach of CIO of acknowledging and saying that this was quite common and that things were handled easily is is also the way that we should do if we become CIO in the future. And also he mentioned that anyway without even knowing uh, without the analyst knowing about the issue, he mentioned that there is a possibility of going for maintenance, which could result in an outage of 3 or 4 days. Uh, it's not for certain going to happen, but if we want to have higher standards, we are willing to do that. So in a way, he prepared the analyst and the market for that possibility, but in a way that those, the market would not react, in a negative, would not interpret that maintenance as a negative issue. Pause here for a minute and answer this question. Another interesting thing about this chapter 18 was how the CIO tried to prevent IT risk. He had a 2 by 2 table where on one part it has the cost of protection, which would be high or low, and on the other side, it had the downside risk or the cost if the risk is materialized. And it had two values, tolerable and intolerable. So if the cost of protection is low, but the downside risk is intolerable, uh, you need to mitigate that risk as soon as possible. You have to do all the measures to avoid seeing that risk being materialized. However, if the cost of protection is low and the downside risk is also tolerable, there is no point, in doing addressing that risk at that moment. The most important, the most difficult decision is when the downside risk is intolerable and the cost of protection is quite high. You cannot be sure if it's worth it to uh, do that high investment to just avoid that intolerable risk. This is a kind of trade-off that the business managers need to make, the top executive, the CEO needs to make. He needs to do the trade-off between the cost and benefit of that investment. And also, uh, we can have a case where the cost of protection is high uh, and the downside risk is tolerable. So for these cases, you just bear the risk. You don't do anything. But it is important that the CIO tell the CEO that, and other managers that sometimes things won't work, uh, but that doesn't mean that the IT has gotten something wrong. It's just that the entire organization decided to live with that risk. Another interesting part of this chapter was identity and access management, which is the process for identifying, authenticating, and authorizing individuals or group of people to have access to application systems and networks. So Jim Barton suggested two different ways of doing that. The first one is category based, where everything in the same category is equally safe, and which means that anyone with sufficient access rights can get access to data in that category. And that means that, for example, all people in the marketing department have access to customers and sales data. We have a category of people uh, of marketing, and they have access to all data and systems related to marketing. The problem here is that we can have either under protection or over protection, and we are going to be more trusting toward the employee that they act according to the rules and law. A kind of competing IAM approach would be to have security at the level of service and data, which means that for each data point or for each service, you define which person or which role can have access to that kind of data. So, for example, customer data such as date of birth and social security numbers, which is equivalent to BSN in Netherlands, is only accessible to VP of marketing, or customer name, address, and orders are only accessible to customer support staff. So as you can see here, we specifically we specify which data point, which service can be accessed by who or which organizational role. So here we don't have any under or overproduction, but the problem is that it has a huge overhead, as you know, setting the system like that and deciding who has this, who can have access to what, can be quite, cumbersome and needs investment. Another issue with this system is that it's slow uh, in terms of data accessibility, as you cannot easily give people access to a category and trust them with the data. And of course, in this system, you monitor access to important data quite, heavily. E- Each access to uh, the customer's date of birth or customer's social security is, stored and logged in the system. So two approaches were suggested by the CIO here, and the CEO needs to make decision about that. We have learned a lot from the CIO Jim Barton about IT risk management and how to respond to an IT crisis. However, the book and or the CIO lacks some, structural uh, changes. The company IBK lacks some structural changes, and the CIO needs to introduce them. And these recommendations that they have is based on a study by Westerman and Hunter, and also a book that later published about that. It, it explains that you need to have a risk governance framework where you specify various types of processes to identify various types of risk and ways to manage them. They also suggest that we need to have a risk aware culture where everyone has enough knowledge about the risk, and the organization allows them to come forward and speak about those issues, raise the concerns about the risk that can be materialized and cause trouble for the organization. And the third uh, practice, Westerman and Hunter uh, suggest that the IT department requires to reduce IT complexity, such as spaghetti systems that we learned in the previous lectures. So having a spaghetti system makes it difficult for the IT department to to come up with backups for those systems, to find ways to ensure business continuity, and with this kind of systems, uh, system that can be replaced, that can replace the current systems in if something happens, or manual business process can replace system when a risk is materialized. It would be, when IT system is complex, it would be also quite complex to manage the risk. So again, Westerman Hunter had three recommendations: create risk governance processes, create risk aware culture, and reduce IT complexity in the organization. So my suggestion to Jim Barton is to take these three recommendations quite seriously, although the government is at good shape at this stage. Pause here for a minute and answer this question. In the next video, I will go over various customer contact strategies after a data breach.